what is keeping you from getting the level of accuracy and the clarity to your financials? Slowing down, taking it in and figuring out what those goals are will take you so much further than just trying to jump into things.
Welcome to Builders, Budgets, and Beers. I'm Reece Barnes, and I started this podcast to have real conversations about money in the building industry, the wins, the mistakes, and everything in between. I believe builders deserve to feel confident about their finances, and that starts by hearing from others who've been through it too. This industry can be slow to change, but the right stories and the right tools can make profitability feel possible. Let's get into it. Alrighty, Scott, mics are hot. We're rolling. Thanks for jumping on.
I appreciate it. Thanks, Reece. This is awesome.
You've been a busy guy. You've been a busy guy going all over the country. You were just in Silicon Valley with Intuit.
I was out there for a lighthouse event. So what Intuit has done is they've built under their customer success program what they call Lighthouse. And essentially what it is them bringing in customers and firms like us at RedHammer to collectively help them move their product that's very customer focused. So it's an amazing experience. Not only do we have the ability to give feedback to the executives, it's a community of people. And so over the course of the last 9 months, I've built relationships with other, like I said, firms and other companies, specifically in the construction industry, that have just been able to extend my network and have other people out there that we can bounce ideas off of and kind of grow together.
I love that. And they bring you in because you're an expert in construction accounting and software. And that's why we have you on today. Scott, go ahead and give the listeners a little background on yourself, what you do over at RedHammer, and then we'll kick things off.
I appreciate that. Thanks, Reece. So Scott Franchini, I'm partner at RedHammer. We're an outsourced accounting company focused on the construction industry. We do controllership down accounting services, and we help developers and general contractors and subcontractors with anything you can think of, from AP all the way to the generation of financials and the WIP. So everybody loves the WIP. We understand the WIP, and we can help companies really use it as a tool. I think that's a key. I think a lot of times people think of a WIP as something that is something they just need for bonding or they need at the year end, but really it's a tool set to really understand if their project is profitable or not, and really kind of cut through and even out things so they can start to really measure their business month over month.
I love that. Okay, so real quick, 2 questions. What types of companies? I know you mentioned developers, whatever, but like size of companies. And then the second one after that is what are the biggest hiccups that you see contractors facing when it comes to tracking WIP?
Yeah, that sounds good. Our typical contractor are $5 to $30 million in revenue. So we really sit nicely in that small to call it middle market. We do have customers that are smaller. We have a lot of contractors that come in for the very first time. They know how to build stuff and they want to start to build systems from the very get-go and do it correctly. And so we can come in, set that up and get them going, and then also help them with the accounting services, which is also kind of a big thing, is that, we have naturally, because of the mere fact that we're in construction accounting and we run into companies that don't have it set up correctly, we've become experts of the software domain. So whether it be QuickBooks or Intuit Enterprise Suite or Sage 100, 300, all the way up to NetSuite, we've touched them all. And so ultimately what's happened is we've become, experts of the domain. And because of that, we've been able to launch an implementation services organization, and it's huge. We're able to come in, not only help companies remediate their accounting, but also remediate their software and look at how we can provide, tech solutions versus them just wasting a ton of money on trying to move to the next greatest thing.
Totally. Well, and we'll definitely get into like just with your expertise and your domain expertise, but also that came with software expertise and product expertise. Like I'm going to want to hear what the gaps are, but I imagine like even just you talking about the contractors that are, call it sub 5 million that are just starting and they want to get things implemented the right way. And then obviously you're working with $5 million to $30 million a year guys. Like I imagine the biggest challenge, correct me if I'm wrong, with tracking WIP is having the foundation in place that is consistently tracking cost and income. What would you say?
100%. So oftentimes we'll walk into organizations and they may be, tracking their cost, but are they tracking it timely? Are they billing within the billing period? And really the biggest problem that we see when it comes to WIP is they don't manage their contracts and they're not managing their budgets. And so ultimately, if you don't have those four things together and you don't have them in a collective manner, you're not going to be able to effectively track your WIP. And so much about what we do is not only is it about getting the information into the system timely, it's about getting the information in just period and making sure that they also understand the impact of it and what happens if I do this and what happens if I don't have that information in the system, like change orders, for example.
Totally.
And managing any sort of costs or budget changes that happen towards the end of the month, or I guess throughout the month, but effectively making those changes in the month so that your WIP represents what your total earned revenue is.
Totally. Well, and that goes into the, gaps in software, right? Because I'm sitting here and I'm like, they could be tracking costs, but you're saying like the biggest gap or one of the biggest gaps is tracking budgeting. Like what are they like tracking in an Excel? They're just not budgeting at all. What are you seeing?
Well,
go ahead.
Well, I think the gap starts from the beginning. So if you think about what contractors do, they're going to go out, they're going to do an estimate or a bid, right?
Yep.
And that from there, they're going to have a baseline contract, right? Mm-hmm. So the first mistake that they make is oftentimes they'll go and they'll budget and they'll bring the budget down in the system in a different form, right? Oftentimes you're a lot more detailed on when you're going out and you're doing your bid. And they may start with an initial budget. But the problem is number one, is getting that in and managing it. But the second problem we also see is that what they budget for they don't necessarily cost it at the level that they need to cost it. So for an example, they leave out things that could be general conditions, or it could be insurance that they're doing on it. And so it's all those little things that we call indirect. And being able to get those things back into the job. So if you think about this, if I budget something for $100,000, right, and I may reflect that budget for $100,000 here, and let's just say that I have $10,000 in overhead that I've allocated that project. Well, if I don't take those, if I don't find that $10,000 and it somehow falls off because it's not something that I direct cost, oftentimes the project gain is fake. It's like, oh my God, I made an additional 10% on this project, when in reality, it's just lost and buried into your G&A on the P&L. So a lot of it is about how do we get them from their bid process? How do we then effectively manage the job cost? So again, contracts, budgets, the actual cost, and then how do we then measure and take some of those the G&A costs, get them back in? And so it's really kind of this job cost 360, because then they can turn around and when they look at that overhead, they can then bid better later on, because hey, maybe they're estimating that as 10% overhead. But later at the end of the project, they realize it's 8. Okay, I have another 2% that I could actually potentially trim off to make me more competitive in the market.
Totally. And so that makes all total sense. But even like a thought that I have is the reason why they go into that $100,000 job and say it's $100,000, but they're not accurately estimating or budgeting for all of the overhead, all the indirect cost. What's the gap there? Is it just like not knowing what the overhead is? How do they get to that number essentially? Because I look at it as pretty like straightforward. You have people that you're paying, you have maybe rent for a building for office, you have trucks, right? You have utilities, you have all these things. Like it seems like that would be the easiest thing to track, but I hear contractors having a hell of a time getting a good pulse on what that number is so they can estimate more accurately and they can be understanding their margin more effectively.
They guess.
And so get why this is like money's going in, money's going out. Like it's not that easy, or what? Like, where's that?
It isn't easy because it's what makes it difficult. And this is oftentimes is they don't understand how to delineate the costs. And so a good example is when we think about a P&L is different in construction. It's made up of all the same parts, but there's the extra part that we add in that middle, and that is the indirect. So we think about direct costs, things that I can cost directly to, right? The easy stuff. I did labor, here's materials, I rented this, crane, right? That's easy.
Yeah.
But when we start to get into that middle section, that indirect, which the way that we define it is these are things that are part of the job that if I didn't have the job, I wouldn't need these things, right?
Yes, heard that.
And it's not the things that keep the lights on, right? It's not my rent. It's not the utilities. It's not, my admin staff that's behind the scenes. It's these things that are directly associated with the project, but they're hard to track. A good example, this is what I often use, is I have a project manager that goes from site to site to site, driving a company vehicle, utilizing company fuel. Okay, how am I going to split that stuff out? How am I going to spread that? So oftentimes what happens is that stuff gets buried into the G&A, and they don't have any way to really separate or delineate that. And so what we like to do is actually break that out specifically within the chart of accounts. We draw those expenses into those accounts, and then we come up with allocation methods to then turn around and get those costs back in. And essentially, because we're measuring that and we're using the allocation method, we can then ultimately measure what the total overhead is associated with it, and then also allude to what that rate should be. And it depends. I mean, oftentimes we're doing at an hour perspective, meaning we're looking at like the rate of the total labor to the. Sorry, UPS just walked in and needs a signature.
You're all good. This is an authentic podcast. You need to sign? Go sign. I'll pause.
All right, we're good. Thank you.
We're good?
That's distracting.
Hey, for the guests, that's what you get on Builders, Budgets, and Beers. This is just two guys having a conversation. It's total authenticity.
So where I was at is so you have this amazing ability then to figure out what that rate is. So oftentimes we're looking at like labor hours. So if I had 4,000 labor hours a month and I have 1,000 on a particular project, well, they're going to get 25% of it. And that may not be the best method for every company. Sometimes that's a percentage of direct costs or percentage of subs, or it could be a percentage of revenue. What we like to do is figure out the method that is best spread out and can be allocated. And then, like I said, then we can start to draw it in. Let's just say it ends up being hours. Well, guess what? We can then figure out on total labor hours and total labor costs what that rate is that can be applied later on when they're going back into the bidding process.
That sounds a hell of a lot better than guessing. I mean, that's just like, because when you do, it's like you got to start from somewhere. And if you're thinking like, okay, well, I've got this guy in the truck that the company owns, it's driving, and I wouldn't have that truck if I didn't have a project manager that wasn't managing these jobs, and they wouldn't be going all these different places here. Where do I start? It's like, we'll just start by categorizing the cost, like knowing where it is, what it is, and then start saying that one project manager is managing 3 different jobs. We're going to split that up between 33% for each job. Am I tracking or am I missing?
That's right. And here's the other side of it too, that owners really need to understand is a lot of times the teams are incentivized on, the gross profit that they make on these projects. Mm-hmm. And what happens is if you don't bring those costs back in, now you end up paying your people more, and you don't realize that you're bleeding that extra cash. Also, I think it's a false sense of placement on the project. You think you're this far percent complete, and then you're not. And then obviously those things come up later that could lead to, profit fade. And, we know the bonding companies don't like that. The banks don't like it. So being is consistent and building out a model for this really, really helps at all angles.
Okay. And then when you're building out that model, this is just starting with percentages and then refining and tuning from there. Or do you have any like tips or tricks on that?
It's funny. We were, to me, the best thing to do is model it. We had a company that we're working with right now that had, I don't know, I think it's $800,000 worth of overhead that we had to turn around and cross apply. And they were actually going in and taking an expense or a bill and allocating it that way. And it was taking an enormous amount of time. And so we're like, no, let's go and let's look back and look at this method. And we went out and modeled our method. And I said, out of curiosity, let's compare. Let's just, because they have different locations around the country. And what we noticed is that they were super heavy in two different states. And it was because they had warehouses in those states and they had a different product that was in there. And so I said, okay, now let's look at this and let's model it similar to what they're doing, but let's do it aggregately versus having to do it transactionally. And we were able to kind of replicate what their model was at a pure direct cost and allocation. And so now we've taken off a ton of burden just by essentially revisiting it and looking at the way that their numbers worked and just remodeling it. And so
interesting.
Just do the math, do the due diligence. I mean, these days it's so easy to throw stuff in AI and say, hey, look at the data, look for patterns. What is the best way for me to break it out? But at the same time, I also want to say is don't make it overly complicated. Sometimes the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And you'll oftentimes find out that you're spending a ton of time doing something that's not very meaningful.
Totally. Okay, not to shift gears here, but I am curious, just even on the point you made earlier, rather less point, more comment of like you guys having seen a lot of software that is touching construction. Like, let's just start this part of the conversation with what would you say is probably the most glaring gap? Unless we already covered it with like the foundation and the fundamentals and how that impacts WIP, but like what would you say is like probably the most glaring gap when it comes to contractors and software and what they're trying to get done?
So every contractor, especially as we start to see them move up, usually around the $5 to $7 million range is when there's an inflection point. Oftentimes we see that the spouse wants to get out of the business. You know, they've helped their husband grow the business and they're doing the accounting and they reach a point where they want to, have their life back.
Totally.
We see that they want to move into some of the commercial side, or they want to go after some government contracts and they need bonding, right? We see that. And of course, if you need bonding, they're not going to give you a bond unless you have capital behind you. And so they're looking at, what their working capital is, and that's super important. So in order to grow, because of the margins and because of the way that revenue trails cost, they need money. And so all these things about growth they're built upon this baseline. And so companies will come to us with their pain points, and they're going to talk about how they don't have visibility to their cash and how they don't know if they're profitable into the end. And the craziest thing that we find out is that 92% of companies don't even have their system configured correctly to get what they want out of it. So they think immediately that that they're held back. For example, they're in QuickBooks and they're like, I need a better job costing system, and immediately, as I said, they're most of the time they're not even configured correctly, but they want to then shoot for the moon. They want to start to go out into the market and go spend a ton of money on software, be it, it could be Intact, or it could be, Acumatica or NetSuite, which isn't a good fit for construction at all, unless you're using one of the third parties that really help that are actually built in. But they're greatly expensive. I mean, think about it. If you're on QuickBooks and you're paying $275 a month, and the next thing you know, you're paying $3,000 a month, and then you're on a tab for $85,000 to $150,000 just to implement it, not to mention 9 months of just pure pain and suffering. When at the end, all they have to do is configure their software correctly, and then potentially go out and use an add-on software that integrates well to do the things that it doesn't do great. And that's the kind of thing we push for, because not only are those projects exhausting, they're not technology projects, they're transformation projects. They impact everything downline. And so you can't just take something that's wrong here and throw it into something that is, we'll say technologically it may move them forward, but not go in and effectively change a process, which is essentially how I'm going to job cost and starting from even just the basics, as well as is the people. Do you have the right person in the right seat?
Yeah.
Do you give your organization the right number of people in order for them to be effective? So oftentimes the issue isn't their perception of the issue, it's something else. And what we try to get them to do is stop making the mistakes of trying to throw money and technology at it, and stepping back and looking at a solution and a tech software stack, or a software stack that might take them down a better path. And it's a mistake that if they do make, it's a cheap mistake. It's not going to impact their organization. They didn't just dump, like I said, 150K and and chase away two of their best people because of the new software that they decided to invest in.
Totally. Okay. What's up, everybody? Quick interruption before we get back into it. If you're a contractor who wants to walk away with an extra $20,000 in your pocket for 1 hour of your time, listen up. On June 30th, we are partnering with Paul Atherton and the team at Highspire for a live webinar, and we're calling it exactly what it is: how to increase net profit. This is no fluff, no sales pitch disguised as a webinar. Paul is going to hand you the actual levers. Overhead you're hemorrhaging right now without knowing it, how gross profit per week tracking can move you from 10% to 15% net margin, and how to stop letting schedule creep quietly kill your projects. Contractors who have implemented this stuff have saved upwards of $300,000 on their bottom line. One guy knocked $46K off his overhead in a single week. So register now. The link's going to be in the show notes. June 30th, 9 a.m. Pacific time. Don't miss it. That is like the Achilles heel, if I'm using that correctly, is the setup. I've seen it. I'll call it 1,000 times. Just talking with contractors. And to your point, exactly. Like, these are people usually doing less than 10 million. But why, like, is that a software gap or is that an industry gap? And the reason I'm asking this is because, like, who should know how to set it up? And, like, why doesn't the product, like, make it easy to set up? And then who becomes the authority of how it should be set up? Because I feel like for these contractors, they're out there and they're reading stuff and they're being told things, and they hire a bookkeeper or controller that's been in construction for 25 years, and they'll set books up completely differently than the last person that had 30 years of construction experience. Are you catching what I'm saying? Like, why does that happen? Why isn't it so binary of NAHB cost codes, plug them in, tied to chart of accounts? This is where these costs go. Like, it seems so simple. Why is that the breakdown?
I think there's a couple of reasons. I think number one, I think it's a reporting thing. I think that oftentimes, if you're a controller, for example, you're going to look at trying to close the books and get that done, and your interest is your financial statements and potentially your WIP, right? Mm-hmm. If you have a staff accountant and you have somebody that's just going in and plugging things away, they're not necessarily going to have a whole lot of visibility to the end product. And then when you start to get into the cash flow side of it and really understanding what you can do with that and trying to draw that in, you start to get into the more of the CFO stuff. But then think about it. You have your project accountants who are looking at your budgets versus actual, and they're trying to keep that super tight. I just think there's so many purviews. I think one of the biggest things that we see is we get a lot of customers that come to us that have bookkeepers or have people that they've hired, even CPAs, and they just don't know how to look at the end game and look at the reporting level in order to drive out and get the best out of the system. And there's not a lot of great resources out there. I think there's a lot of good ideas. But people get stuck into the motion of it and not really the results of it. And I think that's why I said reporting is such a key thing. Like, when we go into a brand new implementation, one of the first things that we look at is, hey, how do you want your business to report? What is your outcome? What do you want to see? What divisions do you have? What segments of the business? How do you want to measure and maximize that? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I go into a client, and large clients that have their cost codes embedded into their chart of accounts. They don't need to be there. Yeah. And because they embed it there, they can't segment out their business. They can't understand what their gross profit is on anything, and it just falls by the wayside, and it just becomes a cluttered mess. And so to us, a lot of it is, how do we break that out? How do we layer it into the right place? Like you said, let's put the cost code structure in. But also, let's be reasonable. We can't go from 0 cost codes to 1,000 cost codes, or maybe even 100 cost codes. We have to be able to grow to it. You also have to be able to understand what your organization is capable of. We see this mistake all the time too, where they'll go and they're like, "Hey, I can budget it. Here's my bid and my estimate. I've broken this down by 200 points."
Yeah.
And that's fine. You can put the budget in there, but you have to have somebody cost it. So unless you're doing commitments and purchase orders where you're pre-coding and somebody's doing that right, you're not going to get the information that you want when you need to start doing your comparisons. So we need to have reasonable expectations when we go out and we start to build a structure around a job costing. And honestly, software is so critically important in this. It is actually probably more critically important than maybe even other industries, because it's all about that measurement at the most micro level to ensure that you're on track. So
totally. Okay, so two things. The takeaway is generally like you need to know what reporting you want in order to structure your software appropriately. And the second, I want to hear the comments that you get from contractors when you ask them what do they want to report on. So the first is just my general takeaway on this is in order for you to properly set up software, like you need to know what you want to report on. And am I tracking?
Yeah, I think that's at the highest level. It's what you want to report on. We go through a lot of education sessions. I spend a lot of time whiteboarding for them, and oftentimes it's taking what they currently have and showing them. Then it's talking about what their net result is and where their pain points are and what their goals are. And then what it's doing is it's blending those two things in together and actually painting a picture for them before we even put it into the system. So much can be done prior to actually going and executing against it. And if you start to paint that picture and help them understand that visually, it makes all the difference in the world. But at the same time, I can paint a pretty picture, but they are the ones that are responsible at the end of the day for executing against it and really being the leader in their organization and enforcing it. It comes from both sides. Like I said, I can paint a pretty picture, but they need to be the ones at the end of the day that hold people accountable.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask is what are the types of, comments that you get when you ask a contractor, what reports do you want? And it sounds like that's the RedHammer experience is the education side. It's not as much as just you're on a sales call and you get asked, what reports do you want? Your software's messed up.
Yeah.
Ultimately is I imagine contractors have a difficult time articulating or even explaining what they want, or is that just not the case?
It depends. They oftentimes understand the ideas of the P&L. I think that they oftentimes will mix up the difference between gross profit and net profit. I think that's a big thing. We talked about that earlier. Indirect costs. How much money am I making? I don't know till the end. Balance sheet, not a lot of clarity. I actually think it's generally the biggest hole is understanding the balance sheet and being able to even do it correctly. I mean, that's where when we go and do assessments, it's most of our issues sit in fixed assets and liability and equity. I mean, those are the three areas that are just a clutter, because a lot of it's pretty straightforward. Otherwise, it's okay. This is how much I make. Here are my expenses associated with it.
Yeah.
They get that concept, but it's the delineation of it too. Like I said before, it's I can look at it collectively and I understand that, but when I start to break that down, I need to understand my per project profitability or my cash flow situations. When there's pay when paid, that's when things get a little bit harder, because it requires a level of discipline in order to get to that. It's frequency and it's accuracy in order to do that right measurement.
That's the finesse side of it. You don't just jump right into that. You need to have that strong structure. You need to have the accountability. You need to have the consistency. And then once you're there, that's when you can really start flexing.
That's correct.
How fast does that typically take for someone that's not doing it that wants to get there? Obviously, it's dependent on the team, right? Yeah. And the capability, but what's a real expectation?
So when we come in, our typical implementations that we go through are anywhere between, I would say, 4 to 12 weeks. And it's fast. and a lot of that is, and bear in mind, is we're gathering a lot of information. We need access to the banks. We need statements. We need, fixed asset documents, depreciation. If there's new assets, I mean, we're essentially going through as if they're going to go through like a review or an audit, and we're gathering the information to establish a baseline. And what that allows us to do is get good visibility into the business. It also helps us understand how they are doing these things. Like, for example, we see all the time, one of the biggest problems in construction is they're not really running accrual-based accounting. And so they're not doing the things like prepaids, and, they're not running a WIP. Their timing is off on the way that they invoice, where they could have all these costs, but then they invoice and they put it at the 4th of the next month, and of course, if you're running a WIP, it'll catch that. But it's just getting them to tighten those things up and becoming more disciplined in it. It's usually 4 to 12 weeks. When I say 12 weeks, that's a hard one. That's us having to do remediation. That's us having to go backwards. Maybe stuff, they didn't close the periods from the previous year and people deleted stuff. Those are usually
brutal
the ones. The 4-week ones are generally pretty quick. And that goes by pretty fast. I mean, because we're going in, we're designing, we're then coming up with a plan. As I said, we're gathering information, establishing a baseline, and then we're effectively going in and doing the change. And we use different tool sets in order to invoke that change. But sometimes, I mean, if you're trying to unstructure a chart of accounts and put that into a cost code structure, that's not easy, because in QuickBooks, if we're doing it there, we're having to move things from accounts to cost codes, and there's not a really simple way to do that outside of just it's almost surgery to try to get that in and not create any problems or issues for the organization.
And what is the surgery? Like, it's just like you go into the transaction and then you're moving, this was the initial account, moving that to the product and service, next invoice. Like, is that what it is?
It's not that. I mean, we have tools that can help that process.
Sure. Okay.
But it's designing it. It's doing everything in the right order. Because we have to move from categories to the cost codes. That's step one. Oftentimes we're unstructuring the financials. So if you think about nested accounts, one of the biggest problems we see with QuickBooks is, it's great on the financial statement, I see all my nested accounts, but if I have to go and code something and I've got it nested 3 times, my account is this long. And it's stuff like that. So what we try to do is get all the minutia out. We try to get them to 120 accounts or less. We try to build a cost code structure that's super reasonable, but it's that unwinding of everything. Because, for example, if I have nested accounts, so let's just say there's 3. If I start removing accounts that are above it before the ones that are below it, I'm going to get errors. If I'm renumbering things, if I don't renumber them in sequence, I'm going to get errors. So it could be a pain. And guess what? The other thing we don't want to do is just necessarily disrupt what happened in the past. So, for example, we're working with a company now that we close out through 2025. Well, we want to maintain that 2025 and effectively make the changes in 2026. Well, now we're having to just reclass transactions 26 and activate the account. The account still exists, and it sits there on the 2025 side. So it's, how do I not disrupt everything in the past, and how do I, pave a path going forward? And that's where I think we spent the other day, we were working on a client, and I think we spent better part of 10 hours trying to just reclass and unwind. It's not something that should be done by anybody either. It's something that you really have to pay attention to what you're doing.
Yeah, totally. Okay. That was super helpful. I'm actually curious to get into your mind. Like, what is and again, I know there's going to be nuance to this, and I can give you a profile of a contractor if that would help you. But what would you say is like the ideal tech stack for contractors? Like, and this could be like your total preference after using all these different tools, knowing the functionality, the depth, the needs. That's why I say I can give you a profile of a contractor. That would be helpful. But just out of your like immediate response, what would the most ideal tech stack be for a construction company?
We like, and this is, it depends. There is a depends there, because different types of contractors require different types of software. But when we love IES now as a core. They're growing on the functionality side. They're super it's techy. They have good AI involved in it. They have good APIs, so it can connect to stuff. It's easy to use, and people understand and they know QuickBooks. We're big fans of Adaptive, your software. We find that it's the best for construction because it speaks to construction. There are other AP software companies that are out there. We like how you knock out, I call them the big three. You knock out the AP side, you knock out the credit card side, and then you also knock out the ability to provide cards to the organization that can tighten that up. I think that the fact that you guys can bring an additional level of guardrails is a big deal to us, where you're able to establish those budgets within the software, and now we're actually forcing people to cost things correctly.
Yes.
I think the level of commitments and what you guys are also doing on the AIA side is a really big deal. And so for us, it's tying in industry specific software on that front end that really drives that. Now, when it comes to project management, I think that's where we start to see things spread apart based on industry. If you're a specialty sub, we're a big Notify fan. I think they do a great job. I think they really service our customer well. We see customers that will go, if they're on the general contractor side, up to builder trend. But to be honest with you, what we see oftentimes is the only thing they use builder trend for, especially the home builders, is for client communication. And they're not really using the functionality, and they don't necessarily get the most out of it. But we have other customers that are very successful with it. And then, of course, the big one, the Procore. I mean, we see Procore all the time on the project management side. Where companies struggle there is on integration. They're all different. In fact, most
integration with like an ERP.
Yeah, exactly. And they're literally all different. Some of them are unilateral, bilateral, and unfortunately, the problem generally is not an issue with either system. It's the people that are managing it because they don't understand what they need to do and need to do it where. So software, like if we go back to like what you guys are doing, it's very bilateral, and I think that's a super important thing. That if I do something on this system, it's doing the same thing on the other side, and it's that measurement of accuracy and knowing that you can trust the data. And so the extension of that is enormous. I mean, I think about this. If I can take, if I were to take 3 of these softwares together and I would stack them together, I could probably do it for a contractor for, call it $1,000 to $1,200 a month, right? Versus them going upstream, and they're still probably going to require some front end software, and they're paying upwards of 3x, $3,000 a month. And then they've also had to take on the capital pain of doing it and the impact of it. And so sometimes it's not, you don't have to go up market on software. There's so much, especially now with what's going on with AI and being able to connect things like Claude. And it's just it's amazing what can be done with current software. Not to mention the functionality at the lower level is really starting to move up. I think I still think the best construction management softwares are in that middle space. I still think that that's why people are holding on to Sage 300. They're not moving up to Intact. That's why companies like Foundation. But the problem with those companies, and this is a big problem, is they're not technologically advanced. And so these companies now, that these contractors are getting a little bit of envy. And so they're like, okay, all this amazing AI, but I can't even connect to a third-party AP company because there's no APIs. I still use a database that I have to ODBC into. And so
Brutal.
I think right now they're sitting there going, okay, what direction do I go? And we're not telling them to go upstream. We don't think that that's necessarily the right thing. It's a lot of money. So coming back down and starting to stack that, and then being able to, like I said, connect into Claude and connect into ChatGPT and be able to do some advanced stuff and just tighten up the way you do your business and tighten up the software and not be that 92% that we look at that is in doing it right. It's a lot easier to do, and it's a lot less stress on your organization.
Totally. Well, and I think so that actually like touched on almost every point that we had talked about, because like just because the piece of software is more expensive does not mean that it's going to be better, right? That's kind of like your upmarket thing, but it's really going back into what are we trying to accomplish? What has been set up appropriately? What guardrails are in place to ensure that what we have set up and what we have implemented is getting used consistently and accurately enough, so then we can start generating the insights that we need. Like, you don't need to run up and grab a big tool for that. You need to know, like, what is the piece of software that is going to ensure that every dollar that leaves my business and comes into my business is being tracked properly and accordingly. That's being reflected accurately in my ERP or my general ledger, also known as like a QuickBooks product or a Sage product, right? So then you can start getting the reporting and the insights that you need, that typically people come to you with saying, I don't have financial visibility. I don't have this. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, there could be 1,000 different things. Running out and buying a big piece of software is not going to be the answer.
Well, and you look at it like this: one of the biggest deficiencies of that middle. I said they're the best construction management softwares. The Foundations and the Sages, but they are the worst at efficiency. Those are the two hardest systems to get information in accurately and timely. And if I do make a mistake, I'm having to reverse things all the way out and bring it all the way back in.
That is so brutal.
It's not efficient. And companies it's the biggest mistake that companies make, in my opinion, is they only consider functionality and they don't go and consider everything else that matters to when you're choosing a software in the organization. And it's crazy. It's like literally just going into a car dealership and buying a car and not going and understanding the features, understanding if it's like buying a Fisker a couple years ago. Hey, look at the financial health of the company before you go like the car, because that the company may not be around and you may not be able to get maintenance, and now you have that's what's happening. So we have to just pay attention to everything that's meaningful in the software. So
totally. No, this has been great, Scott. And this, I mean, you've shared a lot of really strong points. Is there anything? It could be a summary. It could be just a one last sign off. But what's the one piece that you want to send the contractors with before you wrap up?
Number one thing is understand your goals that you want for your organization. Understand the pain points, not necessarily what you perceive, but what is keeping you from getting the level of accuracy and the clarity to your financials. And I think if you dig deep into that, you're going to find that it's a mixture of different things. So really the number one thing is slow down, ask for help. There are people out there like us and even our partners in the software side that are willing to go out there and help you try to create a path. But slowing down and just kind of taking it in and figuring out what those goals are will take you so much further than just trying to jump into things. The other thing I oftentimes recommend: document your requirements. Spend the time to go and document what your needs are. And start with what they are now, and then start to figure out what you need in the future. It's amazing if you go down that path, because what we find is, oftentimes companies will say, hey, I need new software. And we start to document everything, and they realize, a good 50% of them realize, I can do it here. I don't need to go there. So the message is slow down, document, and understand what's going on in your business.
Yeah. I love it. Scott, again, thank you so much for joining and sharing all your wisdom, especially with as busy as you have been. Really looking forward to getting this one out to the listeners.
Hey, I appreciate it, Reece. Thank you very much. This was awesome.
Yes. We'll stay in touch, Scott.
All right. Thanks. Take care.